Hi and welcome to our Patreon exclusive video for the month of June. I hope you are having a wonderful day. Today we will be doing a painting with watercolors and gouache, and throughout the video I will be sharing with you why I use these two mediums on the same paintings most of the times and the difference in between them. So the art supplies that we will be using today are of course watercolors. You're welcome to use either watercolor pans or watercolor tubes, whatever you have in handy, as well as gouache. I am going to be using these Richardson gouache tubes. I've actually never been able to find gouache on pans, so if anyone out there knows of gouache that comes in pans, please let me know because they are my favorite way of working. That being said, we're gonna use watercolors, gouache, watercolor paper of any sorts. I have some options here, either a watercolor paper journal, a watercolor paper sketchbook, or if you just have some watercolor paper lying around like I do, all of these will come in handy. Also, we will be using some brushes, whatever size of brushes you want to work with today, as well as a palette. And this is actually my drinking water, but a bowl with water so we can clean our brushes and work throughout these paintings. And the way that we will be doing today's video tutorial is going to be, first I'm going to be showing you, and we can do it all together, some exercises to first get a glimpse on the difference in between watercolor and gouache, and then we will dive into a painting using both. And at the end of the video I will also be sharing with you some of the paintings that I've already worked on in the past few years where I use both gouache and watercolor, and I think that after doing these exercises together you will understand better why I took the decisions of using watercolors on some parts of my paintings and gouache on some other parts. So yeah, get your art supplies ready, maybe grab a tea, maybe your favorite snack, maybe a playlist that you're very into right now. Get comfy, have your cat friends next to you. I have Leela right here. You cannot see her, but Leela is there. And let's get started. Okay, I changed the angle of the camera so now you can see that Leela is actually there and I'm not making that up. So first, why don't we talk a little about the main difference in between gouache and watercolors. The main difference that we find in between gouache and watercolors is that gouache tend to be more opaque than watercolors. Watercolors, as we know, are a medium that really permits a lot of layers, and the more water that we add to it, the more transparent our painting with watercolor is. And something that is great about watercolors is that we can add a lot of layers one on top of the other whenever we are doing from a very light layer, very watery, very translucent, to something darker. And the same we can apply to pretty much any art medium. So we could use gouache, acrylics, and whatnot. But gouache does have a little bit more opacity to them. So the amount of layers that we are able to use in gouache are limited in comparison to the amount of layers that we can do with watercolors. Also, so knowing this comparison, I usually use my gouache to work on opaque matte layers. So why do I prefer gouache instead of acrylics? That is because it's just a personal choice. Acrylics tend to have more of a brightness to them in the finished product, while gouache is more matte. So what I really appreciate about gouache is that if you see it from any angle, it won't have any shine or brightness to the final product. And that is something that acrylics do have. When we use acrylics, acrylics do tend to shine. And if we don't use the same amount of acrylic on the whole painting, and sometimes we dilute it more or less with water, then some parts of our painting become brighter while the others are matte, and I don't really love that effect. I love the matte and opaque finished look that gouache gives me. So that's why I prefer to use gouache instead of acrylics on a general basis. So other difference to take into consideration in between gouache and watercolors: gouache are light fast. What does light fastness mean? It means that with time, with humidity, and with the direct sunlight, gouache will tend to lose its color within time, while certain types of watercolors are not light fast, and that means that they will preserve their colors throughout time. And just a note here, not every color in your watercolor palette is 100% light fast. This is something that if you are looking to have watercolors that last forever and transcend our physical lives, and they can be in the Met Museum at some point and people 500 years from now can see them, make sure that all the watercolor pigments that you buy make sure to check the light fastness of every single watercolor pigment that you buy. This watercolor palette that I have here is by Case for Making. They use 100% natural pigments from minerals, rocks, and earth. And I made sure to check the light fastness on every single one of them before buying them. So I knew that whenever I'm working on watercolors, my whole palette is completely safe to last and transcend my life and be on planet Earth longer than I will. So just a note there, that's one of the main difference between them. So if you work with gouache, just two things. Make sure to, if you are selling your original painting, let your buyer know that you used gouache for this painting, or you can also only use gouache for the paintings that you won't be selling the originals and you will only be making prints out of them. And that's everything that I know about light fastness. And now let's go and start some exercises so we can see in action the actual difference in between gouache and watercolors. The first thing that I will be doing is putting some colors, both from gouache and from watercolor, on my palette. As you may know from my previous videos, I don't really like to use the colors exactly as they come from the palette. I like to mix them up and cook my own colors. So I will first add some colors to my palette and I will mix them up before I start using them on the paper. This is also a wonderful exercise to get to know the material that we're working with, the colors that we're working with. If this is the first time that you're using your art supplies, it's also a great way to know the colors. They're usually a little different from the colors that we see on the actual tube than the ones that come in real life. And it's just an invitation to really get to know our colors a little more. If you have watercolor pans, using some spray with water is a great way to get them activated. And just like I did with my gouache, I will grab some colors from my palette and I will mix them and cook them a little before I actually use them on the paper. Hi, watercolors. How are you? I've missed you. Thank you for being patient. I'm sorry I haven't played with you in so long. I'm happy that I get to play with you now. So now that I have all my colors here, I will take just a couple of minutes to make my own colors. I love working with desaturated and pastel colors. What do you like to work with? Now I'll do the same with my gouache. Even in these simple steps of mixing my colors in the palette, I realize how much more pigment gouache has in comparison to watercolors. That means each gouache is more concentrated, hence more opaque. What we will do now is we will start with our gouache. And first we will start by wetting our paper. And then with any of the colors we made, we will grab just a little bit. And with any of the colors that we made, we will dip our brush and pass it over the part where we added some water. And then we will grab a little more water and do another one right next to it. And on that way, we will continue doing marks until it completely disappears. Now we will do exactly the same, but this time around, we won't get our paper wet first. Here we can see how adding a little more water can really make a difference on the opacity of our gouache. And now we will try to use our gouache with way more water. Here we're just playing around and seeing the difference in opacity, just to understand how opaque or transparent our gouache can be. And here I will make several lines, one on top of the other, to see how opaque can I go with my gouache. We might need to wait until these dries up so we can keep on adding more layers and making it more opaque. And while that happens, I will do something similar with my watercolors. Remember, we started by getting our paper wet. and then testing my brush in different parts. And here, in just one exercise, we can already see that our watercolor gives us way more range of transparent layers than gouache did. Now let me try the same without getting my paper wet. And these, once again, is not like a scientific experiment or anything. It's just for us to see how different one feels from the other for each of us. And here I'll try to make the line. And while I wait for this one to dry up so I can keep on adding more layers on top of it, I will keep adding more layers into my gouache. Now back to my line with the watercolors. And let's try with my watercolors going straight from the palette. Here we can see that with watercolors we can also make opaque layers depending on how much pigment we add to our layers. And now let's use our gouache directly from the tube. I feel that with this simple exercise, we can take note that with watercolors, we can make a bigger range of translucent layers, while with gouache, we have a smaller range. And of course, we can achieve a lot of translucent layers with both of them. It's just that watercolor gives us the facility of making it easier than gouache does. On the other hand, gouache is great if we want to do more opaque layers. And that's why I stick to watercolors for the parts that I want my painting to be lighter and way more illuminated. And I use gouache for the layers that I want to be not only more opaque, but also more even. That's why I use gouache for my backgrounds. Now I'm going to be painting the same thing 3 times. I'm going to be doing a ginkgo biloba leaf. And I'm doing it 3 times because the first one, I'm going to paint both the leaf and the background with watercolors. The second time, I'm going to paint everything with gouache. And the third time, which is the way that I use the mix in between gouache and watercolor in the same painting, is I'm going to be painting the leaf with just watercolors and the background with only gouache. And that is the way that I usually do it. I do my planets and most of my plants with watercolors. And then the backgrounds, usually I tend to do with gouache. So I think that this exercise is really going to come in handy for all of us to see the difference in between the mediums and also how they look together. So for that, we're going to be needing gouache, watercolors, a palette, brushes, a bowl with water, and some paper. I'm using half of these, so a small paper is fine. Or you can just watch this part because this is more a part to show you the difference of how they look. And right after that, I will be making a painting in a time lapse because I do take forever for each painting. But in this painting that I will be making, I will be using both gouache and watercolors, and it's just to show you why I use each medium for. Now I will be making the same drawing on 3 different pieces of paper. In the first one, I will be using only watercolors. On the second one, only gouache. And on the third one, gouache and watercolors. First, I'm making the same drawing on the 3 papers. This is my attempt of doing a ginkgo biloba leaf. And now I will start with the watercolor and watercolor. So first I will get all the area of the ginkgo biloba leaf wet with water. And once the area of the leaf is full with water, I will start adding my lightest layers of the light for the ginkgo biloba leaf. I let this dry for a second, and now I will start adding a bit more shades. I'm still using the same watercolor color, but this time around I'm using it with less water and more pigment. So I am adding some shadows to the stem and now making some of the veins that the ginkgo biloba leaf has. Now I am working with another color of watercolors that I did. This is a darker color, and these will help me accentuate the shadows within the stem as well as the veins. And I'll also add some shadows to some sides of the leaves. In this way, we give our leaf a little bit more of a 3D look. Of course, this was a very, very fast sketch, so bear with me if it doesn't look completely like a ginkgo biloba leaf. Now that we have our watercolor leaf completely dry and ready, I go ahead and I cook my color for the background. I will be making a dark blue. We get all of our background area with water. And I start adding some of the watercolor to the background. Here I'm trying to be very careful, especially with the sides that touch the leaf, as I want to respect the area where the leaf is and not paint it with my background color, because as the background is darker, there's no way to go back and illuminate that part of the leaf again. Here we can start seeing how the watercolor is not completely even everywhere. So it does have a little texture to it. Now let's get started with our second study, which will be our watercolor leaf with our gouache background. Just like we did in the previous one, we're going to get all of the part of the leaf wet and start adding our lightest watercolor. As I mentioned before, with watercolors, we want to go from the lightest to the darkest. So we start adding layer upon layer, and in that way we start modeling our colors, our shadows, the shape of the leaf, etc. Here I'm working with the same watercolor color, it's just less diluted and more concentrated pigment. I start working on the shadows of the stem, as well as the shadows that the veins in the ginkgo biloba leaf make. Now I will be reinforcing the shadows, this time around with a darker watercolor. Just like we did in the previous exercise, I do the shadows for the stem, for the veins, as well as for the leaf itself in my table. This will reinforce the idea that this is a 3D leaf and not a flat one. I add a little bit more shadows and voila, we have it ready. Now I will be working in the background with gouache. This is the exact color that comes in the gouache tube. And I am using the gouache color with just a tad of water. First, I work in all the outline of the leaf, being very careful not to step or paint on top of the leaf. And then I go ahead and complete the whole background. Here we can see how much more even my background turns out in comparison to watercolors. And finally, we will work on our gouache over gouache painting. So I'm doing a gouache leaf, still trying to imitate the same idea. We start with the lightest color. I realize this is definitely not the ginkgo biloba color, so I go for another try. And this won't be our lightest color. This is something that I love about gouache, is that we can make lighter layers on top of darker layers. You will see. Now for the background. I will first paint my background and then work on all the details of the leaf. Gouache definitely dries faster than watercolors. Can you see how gouache is more flat and opaque than watercolors are? Now that we finish our background, let's go ahead and start working on some details of the leaf. Here I am working on some shadows, both for the stem and for the veins. Now with a darker color. Now I am ready to start adding some highlights. And now let's go even lighter. We add some light in the stem of the leaf. And on the outer sides of the leaf. And voila, we have all of our 3 samples ready. Watercolor, gouache, and watercolor leaf with gouache background. This is the way that I usually work. Now we have Vader behind me. Lila and Vader are taking turns in who gets the nice spot. So here I have the 3 versions. This is the way that I usually use the mixing between gouache and watercolors. And now I'm going to be making a gouache and watercolor painting, which I will show you in a time lapse just for sakes of your time. Telling you a bit of why I choose to use gouache on some parts and watercolors on the others. First, I will be making the sketch for the painting that I will be working on today. I invite you to also make the sketch of your own painting, not the same one that I'm doing, but the actual painting that is flowing through you today. Take your time on this part. There's no rush. Remember that this is just a play. It's a practice to see where our hands want to dance today. And you don't need to know everywhere and everything that you will be doing right now. Now that I have the sketch for most of my painting ready, at least for the part that I need to work on right now, I already marked all the parts that I will be working with watercolor, and that'll be all the insides of these circles. And the first thing that I did was I erased all the lines from where I will be working with my watercolors. Now I have to erase these 4 here, because as I will be working with transparent watercolors, if I leave these lines, they will stay there and they will be visible. And I am leaving these ones here because I will be working with a very opaque gouache, and that means that this line will be erased with all the opacity of the gouache. So why don't we erase these lines here and then get our watercolors ready and start working on the places where we will use our watercolors today. Now I'm going to start mixing my watercolors in order to make the right colors that I want to work with today. Our first exercise for today already gave me an idea of the palette with the one I want to make this painting today. We start wetting the paper in the area we'll be working on, and now we start adding our watercolors. If you take a look here, you can actually see that the lines that I'm following with the watercolors are not 100% exactly the lines in the drawing, so the circles are a little bit more irregular, and the reason why I give myself permission to do this is because the layers of gouache that will go here right next to my watercolors will make all those quote-unquote errors disappear. So that's why I take a little bit more liberty to get outside of the line here. Now I'll go into these 5 circles in here also with my watercolors. I add a little salt to my watercolors to make some texture on them. What I am doing right here is called the wet on wet technique, and I actually have a YouTube video where I share more about it, and I also do in the course Rituals Around Creativity. If you're interested in either of those, I'm going to link both on this video's description or videos post. I don't know what is the right terminology for Patreon. Now I will work still with watercolors in my 4 circles from the outside. Also with the technique of wet on wet. This means that we apply one color on wet paper, and then we add a second layer of color while my paper is still wet, hence wet on wet. There's also wet on dry, which means we let the watercolor dry completely and our paper dry completely, and then we do the second layer. But that is not what we're doing right now. Okay, this is a lot of water on my paper, so I will let these dry for a little while and then I'll start working on my gouache. So while I let all these puddles of water dry out, I will start mixing my gouache color for the background and some colors for the other features that I will be working on with gouache. Now I'm making the same as I did with my watercolors, which is cooking the color that I will be using for my background. I make enough so I can cover the whole background. So now that I have my background color ready, before adding my background color, I will be working on lines around the circles, which I will be doing with gold, and this gold is dry gouache. This dry gouache comes in powder, and I only add some water and make it just like regular gouache. With this dry gouache, I'm erasing all the parts where I did some watercolors outside of the lines, and it seems like that never happened. Here I work with my brush 20 on top of 0, as it is a very teeny tiny brush and it makes me able to work with lots of detail on making a perfect circle. Now that I have all my dry gouache art ready, I will start working on this new circle. Here I will be making a circle that starts with light blue and finishes in white. For these, I have to be very quick as gouache dries way faster than watercolors, and I want it to be as even of a change as I can. First, I work on all the outlines, and then little by little, I start making my color brighter and brighter until it reaches a white. Painting asks for me to be present. I can only work on these before it dries up. Once it's completely dry, I cannot really use this combination of colors as easy as I can when they are still fresh. Along the way, I decided that I wanted to add some more circles with watercolors on my painting. And now that I have those dry and ready, I am able to start doing all the outlines for my background. I do this, as I mentioned before, because this helps me not, not to smudge any of the painting that I've already done. And then I can work on the rest of the background freely and with a little less caution. This time lapse is 12,000 times faster than my actual pace. And that's just another lesson of how much patience art teaches me and maybe teaches a lot of us. 1200, not 12,000. As you can see in this background, I'm still getting my brush wet in order to use my gouache, and that is making some smudges appear in the background, so it's not looking completely flat. That's why I add a second layer of gouache to the background. This will help me even out and have a flatter background instead of one with texture. It would be totally fine, but that's not what I'm looking for today. So now we have all of our work with watercolors ready, as well as the background that we work with gouache and these golden areas that I did with dry gouache. Now I will go ahead and complete all this white area with a dark color of gouache, and right after that I will make some drawings on top of my gouache background to show you how gouache on gouache looks, and then we can start making some comparisons in between my watercolor and my gouache tones. When I'm not really sure what color to use, I just advance with the other parts of the painting. And then somehow, when I have the rest ready, that informs me of what color I need to add to that layer I didn't know what to put in. Now I will start making some sketches for the plants that I will be painting with gouache on top of my gouache background. First, I do a sketch with pencil. Here I have a plant that I'm just making up, and then the other one is chamomile. Now that I have my sketch ready, I start cooking my colors and making the colors that I will be using for my plants. First, I work on a flat color for the leaves. As well as for the stems, the flowers, and the fruits. And little by little, I will start adding some shadows and some lights to each of the elements of the plants. I start by working on the veins of the leaves, and then making the shadows on the leaves as well. Now I know what color I want to put in the middle of my painting. This is a dark teal that I will be adding. And now I'm adding all the lights to my leaves. As you can see, gouache makes us able to add the light after we've worked on shadows. This is something that is a little more challenging when working with watercolors. Now I have my painting ready. So this painting is ready, at least it's ready up until now. I think I might be adding some more details, but I just don't want to make this a 4-hour video. Usually the last things that I would be adding are the black line that I use to outline everything and maybe some stars in the back. Everything is pretty much the same color, so there's not a lot of contrast in here, but I hope it was helpful to get a better sense of the mixing between gouache and watercolor. And I hope this exercise with the 3 versions was helpful as well. And last but not least, I want to share with you just in one painting, a very big painting that I took a lot of time working on, the difference of why I chose watercolor in some parts and gouache on the others. Okay, and this is the painting where I want to show you why I choose watercolor and gouache on the same paper. So here I used for all these planets on the inside only watercolors, and then all the rest of the painting is gouache. And I don't know if you can tell, but those planets in this orbit are the most bright thing from the whole painting. And then for these planets in the outer side, as well as these ones here, I used gouache, as well as gouache for the background and gouache for all the dots that are here. I'm actually also going to show you in the video the actual scan of these. I think you will be able to see more of the details, but this is a great way to show you that when I work only with watercolors, the brightness of the painting is way more because the watercolors are leaving a lot of transparency for the whiteness of the paper to come and shine out, while the gouache is more opaque, so that is making my painting shine less. Even in the areas like the planets in the borders or the planets here, or even the eye in the circle, they are bright gouache colors that I'm using, but they still have some opaqueness, opacity to them in comparison to the watercolor. So I hope this Patreon exclusive video was helpful. I hope you had fun. I would love to see some of your paintings. If you did paint along with me, you can, I'm not sure if you can add them in the comments of the video, but you can always add them in our art section of the Discord community. Let me know how you like this length of videos, if you are totally fine with the length or if you want them to be shorter for the next time. And also, yeah, feel free to let me know what videos you'd like to see in the future. Thank you so much once again for supporting me here on Patreon. It really means the world to me. It really makes me able to live painting and sharing my art. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye. I will see you soon. Happy June.